Welcome to Defining Dad Bod, where my dad, Coach Alex VanHouten, plus his 14 years of experience to work for you. You should listen to him. Here's pretty beast mode. Who knows who we could be if we could become 1% better every single day.
What's up, guys? This is Alex VanHouten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing super well. You're listening to Season 3, Episode 13 of Defining Dad Bod, where we're talking about vitamin D supplementation. This is the 5th episode in our supplement series, and I'm super excited to bring you the research and make the information practical to your health and fitness journey. Just as I've said with each of our supplement episodes, the information in this podcast is not intended to be medical information. We are not diagnosing or recommending treatment for particular medical diseases. And while we do discuss different conditions, and we've included the citations to the research in the show notes below, we highly recommend that you consult your physician to see if the recommendations herein apply to you well. If you need help with that, we do have a dietitian on staff. Shoot us a message at coachal@definingdadbod.com. Before we get to the show, some food for thought. I, Coach Alex VanHouten, manage ulcerative colitis, which is an inflammatory bowel disease that's often comorbid with my genetic disorder, Ehlers-Danlos. And our food for thought this week comes from one of the things that I do to intelligently manage that well. You see, it's becoming a running joke in my social media circles that Alex never wears a shirt. And while it's true, especially in the spring, summer, and fall months, anytime I can get away with it, I shed my upper layer. It's also true that while I have a low % body fat, I don't actually go shirtless to show off. A client of mine told me, "Hey man, don't worry about it. If I looked like you, I'd go shirtless all the time too." But you see, ulcerative colitis makes vitamin D absorption and vitamin D synthesis very difficult. And in fact, the vitamin D deficiency in those with inflammatory bowel disease, both Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, is often associated with an increased risk for colorectal cancer. When I first started Defining Dad Bod, I knew that vitamin D was positively correlated with healthy testosterone, and so I went shirtless as much as possible to help bolster my testosterone levels as a young dad who was wrestling with sleep deprivation and the natural testosterone drop that comes with having new babies in the house. But when I learned about the vitamin D deficiency risks and difficulty synthesizing vitamin D due to ulcerative colitis, I doubled down on my efforts to go shirtless as much as possible. What the heck does this have to do with my food for thought? Well, I can say from experience that you can't judge a book by its cover. If you saw me running through my neighborhood without my shirt on, and you saw a young 30-something dad with ripped biceps and abs, you might think I'm a big jerk who's trying to show off how fit I am and make you feel bad for how fit you're not. It might discourage you, or put you in the strange mindset of fit shaming. Google it, it's a thing. But deep down, me running with Ehlers-Danlos, and doing so without a shirt on, is actually a huge part of me carrying my cross the best way that I know how. By all rights, the dark road of my alternatives might be to be hooked on pain medications, depressed, and die of colorectal cancer in my early 50s. But I want better for myself, and I'm doing my best to become 1% better every single day. And so your food for thought today is this. How often have you judged the book wrongly by its cover? And what are some of the things that you need to do in your own health and fitness that you're not doing because you're concerned how you might appear to others? Here's the thing. I'd really prefer not to offend anybody by running around with my shirt off. But if I have to sacrifice your comfortability to stick around a little longer for my kids and to feel good doing it, then the choice really is a no-brainer. Being healthy and fit for your bio-individual self is a revolutionary act. And the people who are pursuing their best and manifesting it daily might look a little weird to the average population, and that's okay. In fact, given the state of health and fitness in our world right now, I don't know a single one of my clients who doesn't get a raised eyebrow look every once in a while because they're, quote, a weird health nut. What habits or proclivities do you have that make you a little weird in the average person's eyes? But if they asked, the story goes a little bit deeper. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Shoot me a message at coachal@definingdadbod.com. As for me and my house, I won't be putting a shirt on anytime soon, and if you wrestle with your vitamin D, I encourage you to join me in that. I don't care how fit you are. That's your food for thought this week. I hope it gives you something to munch on. Now, without further ado, let's get to this awesome discussion about vitamin D supplementation. Holy cow, where do I even start on the subject of vitamin D? It's not that it's hard to find anything to say about it. It's hard for me to know how to convey to you how important this particular vitamin is in every single aspect of your health and fitness journey. Out of all the supplements we've covered in this series so far, this one is the most far-reaching and the most universally important of any of the supplements I could recommend. And if you've been following me for a while, you know that I don't say that lightly. I'll start this episode by telling you about how I was first exposed to the importance of vitamin D and how that's evolved through my fitness journey. And then we'll take a step back from my personal experience and talk more broadly about human beings as diurnal mammals. I'll give you some fun facts about vitamin D, as well as the researched effects of vitamin D supplementation on health and fitness goals and everything in between. That'll be accompanied by a discussion and some guidelines around exposure to the sun, food sources, and vitamin D supplements. Then we'll wrap up the discussion with some side notes, and finally talk about some very important and recent research of vitamin D and your family's ability to fight COVID-19. Buckle up, it's going to be awesome. So first, 2 personal stories. My first exposure to the importance of vitamin D was 12 years ago, when I was 2 years into my training career and I'd been working with a client for 6 months. She'd achieved a weight loss of 20% of her initial body weight, which was pretty fantastic. I was very happy with it, she was very happy with it, and we were excited about getting her blood work back from the doctor. Per her request, her doctor copied me on the results, and we were all happy to see that everything was moving in a positive direction for her. However, we did find that she was deficient in vitamin D. No big deal, the doctor said. He prescribed a small dose daily vitamin D supplement, and I made an effort to get our training sessions outside as often as possible. Given all of the major wins we'd had up until this point, we really didn't think anything of it. But what happened over the next month was so amazing that it prompted me to do a whole heck of a lot more reading on vitamin D. My client started crushing her workouts, going from small incremental gains in her weight training and cardiovascular program to growing by literal leaps and bounds. My client, who is in her mid-40s, began responding to her workouts in the same way that I would expect a young 20-year-old woman to respond. And what's more, she reported sleeping better, having more energy. She didn't dive into her normal seasonal depressive disorder, and despite expecting an upcoming plateau, you can't keep losing weight forever, especially not at the rate she was. It's like her body doubled down on growing muscle and losing fat, and she dropped 5% more body fat in 1 month. I was in such disbelief as a young trainer that I was concerned that either my client was moonlighting extra training sessions when I didn't know about it, or that she was taking some sort of illegal drug to elicit these sort of performance responses. I asked her about it in a training session and said, look, I don't know what's gotten into you over the last month, but I've got to figure it out because I know so many people who would benefit from whatever's going on with you, as long as it's not illegal and unhealthy. And she said, I'm telling you, Alex, the only thing that's different from a month ago is that vitamin D supplement my doctor put me on. And so I hit the books. I thought I knew anatomy and biology and physiology pretty well at that point, and I knew that vitamin D was an important component in our body, but I had no idea the difference that achieving optimal vitamin D levels versus deficient vitamin D levels could make on literally every metabolic function in a person's body. And so while I consider myself a supplement minimalist with regard to my training programs and protocols with clients, I'm a huge proponent of ensuring that no matter what your health and fitness goal, adequate vitamin D is a part of the process. So what is it about vitamin D that affects every single process in the body and makes it such an important, in fact, the most important in my mind, supplement that I can recommend to my clients? Well, if you really care to understand the physiology, that in and of itself would require several shows to unpack, simply because the role of vitamin D in every single metabolic process in the body cannot be understated. For the purposes of this show, I will simply say that vitamin D is better classified as a neurotransmitter or a hormone than it is a vitamin. And as diurnal mammals, our bodies require significant amounts of vitamin D to either be synthesized or ingested in order to function properly. A quick search of vitamin D will tell you that levels of vitamin D vary throughout the year for every single person, and 40% of Americans are deficient in vitamin D, while up to 80% of Americans are reportedly suboptimal in vitamin D levels, according to the International Vitamin D Council. In one study, where over 80 participants were followed for an entire year, 97% of the participants, that is all but one, had at least 1 month out of the year where they tested vitamin D deficient. These are amazing statistics considering that vitamin D deficiency has been linked to things like depression, cancer, osteoporosis, insufficient hormone production, and even death by acute infection. You would think that more people would be talking about how important vitamin D is. What the heck, Alex? If vitamin D is so important, then why are so many people getting so little of it? And why do our bodies seem to really suck at keeping the right amount around? That's a great question. Let's do a brief history lesson of biology. You, as a Homo sapien, are a diurnal mammal, which means that your circadian rhythm is programmed as such, to be awake and conscious during the day, and to be asleep and recovering during the night. What that means for you is sunlight exposure has been a very significant part of your biological evolutionary history for millions of years. In short, your body has been designed, right down to the level of your DNA and microbiome, to get regular sun exposure in order to provide necessary energy for necessary nutrients. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, or like I said, you could think of it as a hormone or neurotransmitter more accurately. And the largest organ on your body, your skin, is specialized to be able to use the rays of the sun to synthesize vitamin D. I remember in 6th grade biology, when our biology teacher was teaching us the difference between plant cells and animal cells, and we were talking about the amazing properties of photosynthesis in plants, where a plant can take carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water and synthesize energy molecules called carbohydrates, literally out of thin air. And I remember thinking, how crazy would it be to be a creature that was able to just take the rays of the sun and build stuff out of it? They didn't tell us this in 6th grade, because it's not part of cellular biology necessarily. But you as a human being can't make carbohydrates out of sunlight, but you can, just like a plant, harness the energy of sunlight in order to create necessary and important components that your biology requires in order to thrive. Vitamin D is a very well-researched product of your exposure to the sun. The UVB rays hit your skin cells, and that triggers a cascade of metabolic responses that convert cholesterol molecules to vitamin D. And then there's a complicated process that follows, where vitamin D is then activated by the liver and kidneys in order to speak to different parts of your body. You might ask, if we evolved for this process to take place naturally, and it's so important, then why are so many people struggling with this today? Well, look around you. Are you exposed to the sun or not right now? Why? And do you think that what you're experiencing right now existed 50,000 years ago? I know for me, I woke up this morning. I had breakfast in my dining room. I did quite a bit of work from my living room. I needed to run an errand, and I got in my car. And then I entered the store, and then got back in my car, and then I came home, and now I'm recording this podcast. I've had exactly 2 minutes of exposure to the sun today, and even then I'm wearing a short-sleeve shirt and shorts. So it was just my hairy forearms and shins that were exposed to the sun. How much vitamin D do you think I made, compared to one of my ancestors 50,000 years ago, who might have woke up and ran his errand by hunting, then played with his kids and ate lunch outside, with a grand total of 6 hours of sun exposure under his belt before lunchtime? You see the issue here? When you live under the sun all of the time, and you really don't have any other options, you don't even need to talk about vitamin D, because it's just a reality. But if instead you're part of the modern population, who spends most of our time indoors, and if we're outdoors, we're usually clothed pretty significantly, then you could start to see where the natural process of your skin's ability to convert the rays of the sun to an important hormone and neurotransmitter like vitamin D begins to become a subject worth discussing. Did you know that it's well documented that males and females both report higher libidos in August and September than every other month out of the year, regardless of age and regardless of whether or not they have kids or are in a committed relationship? Crazy, huh? Is it also crazy to consider that that is also when the highest levels of vitamin D are found among the population? Because, being a fat-soluble vitamin, they've had all summer to accumulate it, and August and September happen to be the months that they will be the highest in. Or what about rates of death attributed to the flu? If you correlate the number of deaths per capita in a country with the relative vitamin D levels in the population, you can see that as vitamin D goes down because of the change in seasons, the risk of mortality in the flu goes up. These are just some large, global issues for us to keep in mind as we look at the research of vitamin D supplementation together and talk about some practical things you can do in your life to improve your vitamin D function. Before I go any further, a quick recap is in order. First, vitamin D is extremely important, and it might be better called a hormone or a neurotransmitter than a vitamin. And while your body is capable of synthesizing its own vitamin D very efficiently from sun exposure, 40% of Americans are deficient and 80% are suboptimal when tested for their vitamin D levels. And if it weren't for the cultural norms in our modern day, we probably wouldn't be having a conversation about how important vitamin D is to you because your body would likely take care of itself naturally, with sufficient exposure to the sun outside. Now that said, Coach Alex VanHouten at Defining Dad Bod is not going to advocate that we all join some nudist colony in order to make sure we get our vitamin D and live a great, healthy, and fit life. But I am going to walk you through how we can make sure that we're getting enough vitamin D, from what sources we can get that vitamin D. And then I want to dive into the researched effects of supplementing vitamin D to help you create some guidelines, so that as we enter the winter months, you, your family, and your community can be well bolstered and standing on solid ground. First, let's talk about getting enough vitamin D. As we talk through this, you need to understand that vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. This means that your body can regulate how much vitamin D you have and can store some for use in the future. This is different from water-soluble vitamins, which aren't stored in the body, and if your body doesn't need as much as you've consumed right now, it just pees it out. This property of vitamin D is powerful, because once upon a time, we needed to store up enough vitamin D in the spring, summer, and fall to get us through the winter, where we wouldn't be making as much vitamin D daily, and every year the cycle continued. Great system. However, that's one of the things that makes vitamin D recommendations so convoluted. Unlike a water-soluble vitamin, like vitamin C, we have to be really careful with toxicity levels in vitamin D, because oversupplementation can cause vitamin D to build up in fat molecules, and then you end up in a place where your vitamin D is too high, and you're suffering from symptoms because of that. Now I will say, it seems to me very hard to get there, unless you're taking way too much, but I'll let you be the judge of that as we talk through how to get vitamin D. There are 3 ways to get vitamin D. Sun exposure, which we already talked a little bit about, but I'd like to flesh out with you more. The food we eat, and supplements we can take. Out of these 3, sun exposure is the best way to get vitamin D. With sun exposure, you don't have to worry about toxicity. Your body can create 10 to 20,000 international units of vitamin D3 with just 30 minutes of sun exposure on a third of your body. If I lost you in the math there, I'll say it this way. In Oslo, Norway, which is not very close to the equator, and therefore not very strong in UVB rays, one study found that wearing a tank top and shorts on a 30-minute walk outside raised vitamin D levels in the bloodstream in participants as much as a 20,000 IU supplement that day. When we talk about supplements in a second, you'll realize that 20,000 IU is a whole heck of a lot of vitamin D, and it's amazing that your body can produce that in 30 minutes. Another study found in the United Kingdom that just 13 minutes, 3 times per week, spent walking in the sun during a lunch break was enough to keep participants' vitamin D in the optimal range for themselves. Wow, I can hear you thinking, 13 minutes isn't a lot. Why are we even having a conversation about vitamin D supplements? If all I need to do is put shorts and a tank top on, go for a walk at lunchtime. Great question. In fact, if you went and did that, we might not have to have this conversation. But things get a little more complicated than that, as you'll see in a moment. It turns out walking around in the summer is one thing, but the further away you live from the equator, the less likely you're going to be to get vitamin D during the late fall, winter, and early spring months. For instance, one study in Boston, Massachusetts found that from the months of November to February, that's 4 months out of the year, a 30-minute walk outside with half of your skin exposed produced literally 0 change in serum vitamin D levels in participants. And even worse, a similar study in Norway found that from October to March, which is 6 months out of the year, a 30-minute walk outside did nothing for vitamin D levels. These 2 particular studies were done on fair-skinned individuals, and it turns out the darker your pigment is in your skin, the more intense the UVB rays need to be, and the longer you need to be outside in order to sufficiently synthesize vitamin D levels. The reason for this is that the melanin in the skin blocks the UVB rays, a lot like sunscreen would, and so it's unable to penetrate to the cells in order to be used to synthesize vitamin D. In fact, in addition to being over the age of 65, having dark pigmented skin is the #1 risk factor in being deficient in vitamin D. Furthermore, while studies are kind of up in the air about how sunscreen might affect things, a preliminary look at peer-reviewed literature suggests that up to 98% of vitamin D synthesis is eliminated by applying sunscreen to protect your skin from UVB damage. So you see, sun exposure is a lot more complicated than just saying, let's go outside, it's good for us to get vitamin D. And it's even more complicated if you're somebody who doesn't go outside very often, and then all of a sudden you want to dive into this vitamin D train full tilt. My recommendation to clients spans the gambit here, depending on where they're coming from, whether or not there are risk factors to their vitamin D deficiency, and especially whether or not they're testing their vitamin D deficiency. But here's a rule of thumb. Get outside for 30 minutes a day with a third of your skin exposed to the sun, and you will be very unlikely to be deficient in vitamin D. But what if I can't get outside? What if I'm dark-skinned? What if I'm over the age of 65? Or what if I live very far from the equator, and there are a lot of winter months in my future? All good questions, and here are some answers. The other two sources of vitamin D in our lives is food and supplements. Food sources include fatty fish, eggs, mushrooms, and even a lot of processed food products are fortified in vitamin D. Although you won't see me advocating for vitamin D fortified Twinkies anytime soon, it's important to be informed if you're in a risk factor population. You've heard me suggest eggs and fish many times on the show regarding getting enough omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. A side reason why I recommend these regularly has to do with vitamin D. In my house, me and my boys regularly eat sardines and salmon right out of the can, and I eat eggs for breakfast almost every single day. My wife, on the other hand, not so much. She can't stand the smell of fish. I just got her to eat blackened salmon after years of trying, and she's very happy with eggs maybe 2 to 4 times a week. I think this natural proclivity comes from a few different places, one of them primarily being my Dutch heritage, which is traditionally farther north from the equator, than my wife's Native American heritage, which is naturally much closer to the equator. Maybe I'm wrong, but my hypothesis is that it's built right into my Dutch heritage to appreciate seafood, whereas my wife would have traditionally gotten plenty of vitamin D from her heritage, and so sardines will always make her gag. I'm hoping that some of the nutrigenomics companies, the ones that do a genetic test and then tell you a little bit about your heritage and how you should eat because of it, might actually help to shed some light on hypotheses like that, but I digress. So if you're in a risk factor population, try to develop a taste for fatty fish and get that in your system regularly. Also, consider getting eggs into your nutrition plan. And if you're concerned about the cholesterol, a life hack I learned is that you can eat eggs every day. One day, do egg whites. The next day, do egg yolks. That way, instead of flooding your body with dietary cholesterol every day, which the literature seems to suggest only makes about 10% of your total blood cholesterol anyway, then you can mitigate the issue that way. And again, mushrooms could be a really powerful thing for you. Don't knock it till you try it. I wish I could tell you that tacos and hamburgers had lots of vitamin D in them, but that's just not the case, unless you're making salmon patties. #lifehack. Okay, thanks for the vitamin D menu, Alex. I'll do my best. Talk to me about supplements. You got it. Let's do it. I want to tell you about the studied effects of vitamin D supplementation, which are a little bit different from getting enough vitamin D from sun exposure, and then we'll talk about the actual amounts of vitamin D that might benefit you. Before I say any of this, it's really important that I say 2 things. 1, I'm not a doctor. What I'm telling you here is not intended to diagnose or treat medical issues. I'm simply relaying the research to you, which is in the show notes below if you care to research for yourself, so that you can make intelligent decisions about how to get the best amount of vitamin D for you. The second thing I would say is that with regard to supplementing vitamin D, it would really help you to get a vitamin D test to understand where you're starting and whether or not vitamin D supplementation would be beneficial to you. The amount of vitamin D that you should take every day really depends on where you're at right now. Without that information, you're really shooting in the dark, which I guess is better than not shooting at all, but it's hard to hit the target that way. So here you go, vitamin D and its effects. Specifically, we're talking about vitamin D3 supplementation here. There are a few different versions of vitamin D, but the most useful to the body in supplement form is D3. D3 supplementation has been linked to a lowered risk of falls in the elderly population. It also shows a minor positive effect on cardiovascular disease risk. Also, there's a direct and strong correlation with lowered parathyroid hormone and a significant decrease in colorectal cancer risk. The other 2 effects that I think are particularly profound is a small but notable decrease in body fat in those who supplement vitamin D, and a small but noticeable effect in the risk of death associated with respiratory infections with those who supplement vitamin D. This last finding is particularly important since we're headed into flu season and we've got a new coronavirus to worry about. In fact, I intend to end this conversation with a quick review of some of the promising literature around supporting your immune system and treating COVID-19 with vitamin D supplementation. All of that said, it's very clear. Whether it's for your hormones, seasonal depressive disorder, immune function, bone health, metabolic function, lowered body fat, lowered risk of cardiovascular disease, and lowered risk of death due to cardiorespiratory viruses. You need to be getting enough vitamin D. But how do you do that, and how much is enough? Great question, and unfortunately it depends on who you are and who you ask. Basically, there are 3 institutions that weigh in on what the population needs around vitamin D actually are. That's the Endocrine Society, the Institute of Medicine, and the Vitamin D Council. Now, I'm not going to list out these numbers necessarily here on the show, because I feel like that would be really boring to you, and I doubt you would retain any of it. But I did include a snapshot in the image of the show that you're very welcome to reference. The link to the show website is in the show notes below, and that way you can get an idea of what numbers are deficient, insufficient, sufficient, and adverse effects or risk. Personally, I highlight vitamin D in my clients' blood work if it comes back less than 40. At that point, we work to clear vitamin D supplementation with their doctor if there are any underlying health conditions, and we make a plan to improve our sun exposure. And with me personally, I know that I do best with my vitamin D around 60. It turns out that part of that colorectal cancer disease lowering has to do with vitamin D's positive effects on ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Anecdotally, I actually find that I have more flare-ups in February and March of every year than I do in all of the other months combined. And though I don't do a vitamin D test every month, logic says that those are the times when my vitamin D would be lowest, after several months of winter sun. And so the goodies. How much of what supplement should you take? Well, if you're in the spring, summer, and fall months, and you're getting 30 minutes of at least a third of your body exposed to the sun on a regular basis, unless you actually come back with a test showing vitamin D deficiency, I don't recommend supplementing at all. For most people, that level of sun exposure is sufficient during those months. But if you're in one of the demographics that show risk factors for vitamin D deficiency, that is, being over age 65, having darker pigmented skin, living far away from the equator, wrestling with obesity, unable to go outside, or going through harsh winter months, then vitamin D supplementation is going to be very important and very powerful for you. I have some resources in the show notes to talk you through some of the ranges, but the recommended daily allowance right now for vitamin D for an adult individual is 600 IU per day. You can get that with 3 servings of sardines, a pound of mushrooms, or a very low-dose vitamin D supplement. However, many authorities believe that this RDA is the bare minimum, and not nearly enough to help the adult population achieve optimal vitamin D levels. In fact, the Vitamin D Council says that in order for the average person to get enough vitamin D daily during the winter, they should be consuming 10,000 IU of vitamin D every day. As I'm sure you noticed, that's over 10 times the recommended daily allowance. And so what should you do? Well, it would help you to know that the consensus is it's safe to supplement with 4,000 IU of vitamin D daily if you're not getting enough sun exposure or if you're in one of those risk factor demographics. So what I coach my clients to do if vitamin D is an issue is to keep a 2,000 IU vitamin D3 supplement on hand. And in the winter months, take 1 to 2 daily while getting a vitamin D test done in the middle of the season. This ensures that they're getting at least the maintenance amount and not getting more than the consensus says around toxicity. Even then, though, I've had some come back with their vitamin D test, and they're still deficient, meaning that we need to up the ante. But I hope you see here that the vitamin D supplement needs of the population are very hard to generalize, and if you're interested in helping yourself, you need to know where you're starting. Most primary care physicians will do it during a yearly if you ask, and there are a number of services now that have cropped up online to help you get a relatively affordable vitamin D test for yourself. In my opinion, next to a body fat analysis, it's probably the most important marker of your health that you could get this year. Some side notes about vitamin D supplementation you should know. What about cancer, Alex? I get that question pretty often. And I'm not the only one who gets it, and I'm not qualified to tell you what you should do about skin cancer. But I will say that there are mechanisms that are very powerful in your body that, depending on your heritage, are upregulated by vitamin D in order to fight cancer. And so, the more optimum your vitamin D levels are, the less likely you are to develop different cancers. Again, that research is in the show notes below. But if you're very concerned about sun damage and skin cancer in particular, the Vitamin D Council recommends that you get 10 to 30 minutes of sun exposure and then apply your sunscreen so that you can start the vitamin D process and then protect yourself against harmful UVB rays. If you have a family history of skin cancer and you consider yourself high risk, this is yet another reason to be well versed in vitamin D supplementation and to get your levels tested regularly, since perhaps you would rely a little less on the sun to meet your vitamin D needs. And it's important to note that there are contraindications to vitamin D supplementation. Excessive alcohol consumption is one of the risk factors with vitamin D supplementation. Additionally, if you have kidney disease or are at risk for developing kidney stones, you want to talk to your doctor about vitamin D supplementation. And another interesting interaction I stumbled upon while researching for this show was vitamin D and cholesterol medications. If you're currently being treated for high cholesterol, it's very possible that your vitamin D levels are actually rising as a result. And so you should be careful about vitamin D supplementation at the same time. Again, only a test would tell you where your vitamin D levels are right now, and you should consult your doctor if any of these contraindications describe you. Now I know we've covered a lot, but I want to end with an important note about COVID-19. I recorded this episode on September 21st, 2020, and just 2 weeks ago, several studies were published about the effects of vitamin D supplementation and vitamin D deficiency in treating and preventing COVID-19 in a study of 489 individuals who were randomly tested for elective procedures at hospitals during this COVID-19 outbreak. A study found that if you're deficient in vitamin D, specifically less than 20 nanograms per milliliter of vitamin D in your bloodstream, then you are 2 times more likely to test positive for COVID-19 than somebody who's not vitamin D deficient. What's that mean? Well, preliminarily, we could say that vitamin D deficiency is a risk factor for not being able to fight off COVID-19 before it becomes a detectable infection. Another powerful peer-reviewed study from Spain showed that patients treated for COVID-19 were much less likely to end up in the ICU if vitamin D supplementation was added to their treatment plan. The results were significant. Out of a study of 76 participants, 50 of the patients were in a group that were randomly assigned to have vitamin D added to their treatment plan, and only 1 of those 50 people ended up in the ICU. However, in the group of 26 who did not get vitamin D supplementation as a part of their treatment plan, half of them, 13 out of 26 of them, ended up in the ICU. It's important to note that these individuals were given 10,000 IU of vitamin D twice weekly upon being diagnosed with COVID-19 and hospitalized. And currently there is no data on how powerful an effect it might be for you to have high enough vitamin D now and then be exposed to the novel coronavirus. I say, as we're heading into the winter months, it can't do anything but help you to start working on your vitamin D levels now. And while it's likely we'll continue to see powerful studies that show vitamin D supplementation being a helpful part of treating COVID-19 and even preventing it, there's a myriad of studies that show that vitamin D supplementation and optimal vitamin D levels have a powerful role to play in us fighting influenza well. And I know we've got a pandemic to deal with, but flu's not gone anywhere either. So why not give your body what it needs in order to fight these things well? Thank you so much for joining us for our supplement series here. If I missed any of your questions that you'd like me to answer with regard to vitamin D, join the Inner Circle at definingdadbod.com/inner circle. I go live every month to do a Q&A on your questions, and through social media, we can be connected so you can ask your questions whenever you like, and I usually get to those each day. And even if I don't have all the answers, I usually know what direction to point you in so you can find them for yourself. And if this episode has been helpful to you, I encourage you to check out our other episodes regarding supplements specifically, or if health and fitness in general is very interesting to you, I promise we've got something here for you as well. We've covered creatine, magnesium, fish oil, probiotics, and now vitamin D, and we're adding more every week. I appreciate you joining us here and for your feedback. This has been Coach Alex VanHouten with Defining Dad Bod. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names.
1, 2, 3, 4.
The free, practical advice and conversations here remain unbought and unbiased thanks to the support of listeners just like you. If this episode's been helpful to you, please share it with somebody in your life who you know it will benefit. Then, subscribe to the podcast and leave us a raving review to tell others what value Defining Dad Bod has brought to your health and fitness journey. And finally, if you want more Defining Dad Bod, consider joining our online community. We send a lot of free perks and resources your way, and I, Coach Alex, go live every month to talk through our listeners' health and fitness questions to make the practical science of this show applicable to everyday life. Everyone's welcome, and we'd love to have you. For more information about joining the Inner Circle or becoming a supporter of the Defining Dad Bod podcast, go to definingdadbod.com/inner circle. That's definingdadbod.com/inner circle.